Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar. For those of you who have been here before, you know this. For those of you who are new, I will tell you that the seminar is a collaborative effort of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, in whose space we currently sit, and the American Historical Association's National History Center. My name is Eric Arneson. I teach history at the George Washington University, and I'm the co-chair of this seminar. At the outset, I want to extend our customary thanks to two people in particular, the Wilson Center's Pete Bierstecker and the National History Center's Associate Director, Amanda Moniz. These are the folks behind the scenes whose labors, and they are extensive, ensure that this seminar happens and comes off without a hitch. So for their logistical and leadership support, we thank them greatly. I want to point out that we have Dane Kennedy with us, who is the chair, the director of the National History Center as well. I also want to thank the institutions that make this seminar possible, especially their financial assistance that underwrites these gatherings, particularly Schaefer, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, as well as the George Washington University Department of History and various individual donors. It is my privilege to introduce this afternoon's guest, Adam Rothman, who is an associate professor of history in the Department of History at Georgetown University. Adam received his BA from Yale in the field of history and his PhD in the same from Columbia, and has been teaching 19th century history, the history of slavery, the history of the Atlantic world at Georgetown since 2000. His first book was Slave Country, American Expansion and the Origins of the Deep South, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2005. And his newest book, right here, Beyond Freedom's Reach, A Kidnapping in the Twilight of Slavery, was also published by Harvard this past year. You may have noticed coming in, there are copies of the book for sale outside after this seminar. Adam is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. He's the co-editor of Major Problems in Atlantic History, and he's at work on two books, Emancipation in the United States and Global America. You can follow him on Twitter at A Rothman History, and I should also say that in addition to his scholarship, he has written on slavery, the Civil War, and emancipation for such outlets as the New York Times, the Daily Beast, Al Jazeera America, and others. Today he will be speaking on the topic of his new book, Beyond Freedom's Reach, A Kidnapping in the Twilight of Slavery. Adam.
Thank you, Eric. I think I'll stand so you can see me a little bit better and possibly hear me a little better as well. Today, I'd like to take you rather far afield from where we are right now. I want to take you to the Orleans Parish Jail. It's January 1st, 1863, an auspicious day in American history. That's the day that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. 1,000 miles away, in the Orleans Parish Jail, languished, a woman named Rose Herrera. She was there with an infant child, and she was a slave. And she remained a slave because the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to New Orleans. She'd been thrown in jail a couple of weeks earlier for striking a white woman in her household, the aunt of her owner, by some accounts, a woman who actually did own her. And as Rose Herrera sat in jail day after day, a woman named Mary DeHart, who had been the wife of her former owner, kept visiting her in jail, kept asking her, imploring her, to go with her to Cuba, where Mary DeHart's husband had already fled. But each time that Mary DeHart came to visit Rose Herrera in jail to ask her to go to Cuba, Rose refused. She refused, she said, because she didn't want to leave her friends and family in New Orleans. She was getting progressively sicker in that cold and clammy jail cell in New Orleans, but still she refused to go. Finally, in the middle of January 15th, 1863, Mary DeHart took 3 of Rose Herrera's children, which she held in her possession. She boarded them on a steamship called the Bio. And Mary DeHart, her Aunt the widow Roland, and those 3 children steamed to Havana. That was the kidnapping in the twilight of slavery. When I first came across this story, I was really astonished by it. I thought it revealed so many different aspects of the tangled history of emancipation during the Civil War in the United States. And I felt that I had to explore it further. I had to find out more. I had to find out as much as I could. Most of all, I had to find out what happened to the children. And that was the genesis of my new book, Beyond Freedom's Reach, A Kidnapping in the Twilight of Slavery. Today I just want to sketch out the outlines of Rose Herrera's life, the story of the kidnapping of the children, her desperate efforts to get them back on the eve, or at the dawn of emancipation. But before I sketch out the outlines of the story, I just want to give you a sense of why I think this story is so important. First of all, it gives us a history of slave emancipation in the United States that has a human face. I think by and large, the histories that historians have written of slavery and of emancipation have been written in the aggregate, in the mold of political or social history, where individual enslaved people sort of crop up, more as evidence for a thesis or an argument, than as a fully fledged, well-rounded life in him or herself. So when you come across a story that allows you to delve into the true biography of an enslaved person, I think as a historian you have to jump at that opportunity. Moreover, I just don't think we are familiar with that many people who endured slavery and lived through to emancipation. We know some famous people. We all know Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. But how many of us know more people than that, especially enslaved women who made their way to freedom? So this was an opportunity, I think, to add another name and another life to the annals of our history. So it's history with a human face. Beyond that, I think the story of Rose Herrera and her children dramatizes key themes, key aspects of the history of slavery and emancipation. And I'll just tell you 3 that I think are exceptionally important. The first is the idea that throughout the history of slavery and into the period of emancipation, there was a basic struggle between masters and slaves over 2 different and rival concepts of belonging, of possession or ownership. One concept of belonging was rooted in the legal regime of property rights. It's that legal regime of property rights that allowed Rose Herrera's owner to say that Rose Herrera's children belonged to her and not to their mother. On top of that legal regime of property rights, slave owners erected a whole moral construct that made them truly and genuinely believe that their possession over their human property was legitimate, benevolent, even sanctioned by God. That was one concept of belonging. But against that concept of belonging, enslaved people had their own idea of belonging, a sense of belonging rooted in blood and family and kinship. Some articulated it as a natural right to their own children. to their family members, their husbands and wives. So these two concepts of belonging, one rooted in property and one rooted in family or kinship, were at war with each other through the entire history of slavery. And at the moment of emancipation, that conflict really erupts into view. And I think the case of Rose Herrera and her children illustrates that beautifully. The second important concept or theme that Rose Herrera's story illustrates is the idea of the mayhem, the utter mayhem of the process of emancipation. I think, certainly in the popular imagination, and even to some extent in the historiography, in the way historians have written about emancipation, it's too sanitized, it's too clean, it's too linear. There remains an image of Lincoln as the great emancipator, as if slaves could be emancipated by the stroke of a pen and not by social and military struggle on the ground. We have a linear idea that people went from slavery to freedom, almost inevitably, almost automatically. But it didn't happen that way. And in some cases, people who were freed, or at least tasted freedom during the war, were snatched back into slavery as Confederate troops regained territory that they had lost. So it's that back and forth, that ebb and flow, that twisted path to freedom that I think is important to emphasize. And certainly Rose Herrera's children were on a very twisted, very tangled path to emancipation. So the process of emancipation was full of mayhem, full of violence, full of struggle. And certainly the case of Rose Herrera illustrates that, as we'll see. And finally, I think the case of Rose Herrera and her children illustrates the truly revolutionary quality of slave emancipation during the Civil War. W.E.B. Du Bois asked in Black Reconstruction, how can we imagine this spectacular revolution? And I fear that we as historians have not done a good enough job imagining emancipation as a true revolution. And the reason why this is important is because 150 years later, I think it is too easy to minimize, to downplay, to underestimate the impact of emancipation on American history. Still today, African Americans and their allies struggle for justice in the United States. The failures of emancipation still seem so palpable that many people, I think, end up dismissing emancipation. This is certainly true of many of the students that I have in my classes who don't see the significance of emancipation. There's racism before, racism after, so what's the big deal? Well, I think a story like Rose Herrera's helps us to understand what the big deal really was, the revolutionary quality of emancipation. So those are three themes that I think Rose Herrera's story helps us to understand better. It really humanizes the process of emancipation. It reveals that conflict between two concepts of belonging. It shows us the mayhem of the process of emancipation and also the truly revolutionary quality of that experience. So, how does it do all that? Well, let me tell you the story of Rose. The story of Rose starts in Pointe Coupee Parish, which is a rural parish above Baton Rouge, 150 miles from New Orleans. This is the parish where Rose was born. We actually know, at least there's a record of her birth, a baptismal record, which says that she was born on December 13th, 1835. It's quite unusual to know the exact birthday of an enslaved person. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, wrote that he didn't know his birthday, and most enslaved people didn't either. I don't know if Rose knew exactly when she was born. She knew roughly when it was born, but the baptismal records help us place it with some specificity. That baptismal record also identifies her owner, a Creole planter named Octave Leblanc. It identifies two godparents, but it does not it identifies as well Rose's mother, a woman named Léo Caddy, but it does not say anything about her father. Absence of paternity is a hallmark in the records involving the birth of slaves. Very rarely will you see a father mentioned in the baptismal record of a slave. The map that you're looking at here is a map from the 1850s, one of the most remarkable maps, I think, in American history. This is Norman's chart of the lower Mississippi Valley. Not only does it give you a map of the lower Mississippi Valley, its topography, and the meanderings of the river, but what it really is a map of property ownership. It identifies all of the planters along the Mississippi River from below New Orleans up to Natchez. On this map, this would be the west bank of the Mississippi River, there's a landmark J. Stinson. It's right here. That's the plantation where Rose was born. It's called Stinson here, not LeBlanc, because in 1853, Octave LeBlanc sold his plantation to an Anglo planter named Stinson. This was in the roaring 1850s, when the price of cotton was escalating. There was a consolidation of cotton plantations, a transfer to new capital, and an incredible explosion. It's this moment when Octave LeBlanc sells his plantation, and with it, about 30 slaves. He leaves them behind. But he takes with him 7 or 8 slaves who are described in some records as household slaves. And one of them is Rose. So LeBlanc sells out, and he moves with Rose and his household slaves to New Orleans in 1853. Now, at that point, Rose would have been about 18 years old. Here's New Orleans in 1852, a bird's eye view, a panorama view, the kind that was very popular in illustrations from that moment. You can see it's a bustling commercial city with steamships plying the Mississippi River with a certain vigor. This is the city that Rose arrived in 1853, probably the worst year in the history of New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina. That was a plague year in New Orleans. A yellow fever killed about 1 in every 7 New Orleanians in 1853. This is the city that Rose was taken to by her owner. Octave LeBlanc set up shop with his son as a commission merchant in New Orleans. In fact, it's interesting, you can find him in the Dunn commercial records that evaluate the credit worthiness of every businessman pretty much in the country in the 1850s. Well, LeBlanc is there as a gentleman. He might have been a gentleman, but he was saddled with debt. Debt is the reason why he sold his plantation in 1853. It's also the reason why, ultimately, he liquidates his assets in 1857. He sells his remaining human property, including Rose. In fact, between 1857 and 1861, a span of 4 years, Rose was sold 4 times. This in the churning slave market of New Orleans, the leading location for the buying and selling of human property in the United States, an anchor of the domestic slave trade. It was a routine business. You can find advertisements for human beings in the newspapers in New Orleans, like we find car advertisements today. Here's an advertisement from the Daily Picayune, March 13, 1858. This is an advertisement for the sale of LeBlanc's remaining slaves. And you can see Rose's name on that list. Rose, aged about 20 years, good washer and ironer with her 2 children, aged 3 and 18 months. So it identifies her as a household servant. You can see above Rose's name is the name of Leo Cadi. That was Rose's mother, aged about 40 years, good cook, washer, and ironer, and other men and women and children whose relation to Rose I've never been able to figure out. So Rose was sold 4 times between 1857 and 1861. She ultimately ends up in the hands of a man named James Andrew DeHart, who was, of all things, a dentist. He was an advertisement for his dental office in New Orleans. It's a strange world, one in which a dentist can own a slave. You might wonder what he was doing with her. It's a pretty safe bet that he didn't actually employ her in his office, but he used her as a domestic servant, as a cook, as an ironer, as a nurse, to his own son, named Edward, who was about 8 years old at the time, a housekeeper to help his wife, Mary DeHart. So all of these sales you can track with precision through the notarial archives in New Orleans. Because slaves were classified as real estate, their sale had to be recorded by a notary. The notarial archives are very well kept, very well archived. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of bills of sale of people just like Rose, just sitting in that archive in New Orleans. So we can follow her through this paper trail of tears from one sale to the next. And as she's sold, she keeps getting sold with more children. So by the time she's actually purchased by DeHart, she has 3 children. And we know at that moment when she was purchased by DeHart, she was actually pregnant with a 4th. None of these bills of sale, just like the baptismal records, none of these bills of sale tells us who the father of the children was. But luckily, in this case, we actually don't have to speculate. It's a really interesting story. Sometime in the late 1850s, Rose married a free man of color named George Herrera, one of the thousands of free people of color who lived in New Orleans before the Civil War. It was one of the cities with the most prominent, substantial classes of free people of color. There's a bit of a myth that free people of color in New Orleans were kept to themselves, kept their distance from the slaves, and some were slave owners and probably did. But there's a kind of hidden history of alliance, of sociability, of mixture between free people of color and slaves. And the marriage of George Herrera and Rose, I think, is a great example of that. In later testimony, Rose she asserted that she and George had been married in the cathedral in New Orleans, but there's no record, no church record of their marriage. Because for the most part, the church did not record marriages of slaves. That would have led to a whole host of consequences that the slave owners of Louisiana weren't willing to accept. But they were married, and they had children together. They didn't live together, but they had children together. We don't know what the nature of their relationship was. We don't know how they met. We don't know how often they got together. There's so much about Rose's life that we just don't know. But I think just these fragments of information are enough to at least weave the outlines of the story. But I think what is most germane to this particular story, and what you have to keep in mind, is that even though Rose Herrera's children, even though George Herrera was the father of Rose Herrera's children, by law, they did not belong to him. They belonged to Rose's owner, the DeHarts. So that's one of the most important facts of the case. Now, it turns out that James DeHart finalizes the purchase of Rose Herrera 3 days before Louisiana seceded from the Union. He probably thought he had made a good investment at the time. Little did he know that within the space of 4 years, slavery in Louisiana would be abolished, and his investment would essentially disappear. Now, it's ironic because, of course, the slaveholders of Louisiana, as well as the Confederacy as a whole, seceded to protect slavery. That was the avowed purpose of secession. But secession led to war, and war led to emancipation. And in a sense, they dug their own graves. as slave owners. Of course, only in hindsight do we know that secession led to war and war led to emancipation. In the actual event, that progression wasn't so clear. It wasn't inevitable that secession would lead to war, or war would lead to emancipation. In fact, it was only really the duration of the war, the tenacity of Confederate resistance, that compelled the Union to walk down a path of emancipation. But that path, as I said at the beginning, was a tangled one, a twisted one. And one of the places where it took the most twists and turns was in New Orleans. At the end of April in 1862, the Union Navy and Army captures New Orleans. So from that point to the end of the war, New Orleans rests in the hands of the Union. That is the reason why the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to New Orleans. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to territory that was still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863, and New Orleans was no longer in rebellion. So from the time the Union Army enters New Orleans all the way through the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union government is actually committed to upholding the rights of at least loyal slaveholders in New Orleans. It's committed to preserving slavery. Although at the same time, the arrival of Union troops and Union government launches a process by which slavery erodes bit by bit. In no small part from enslaved people in the city taking matters into their own hands, seeking out allies in the Union Army and the Union government that's come into power. I came across a really remarkable diary of a Confederate woman named Anne Penrose. It's a 200-page diary. She just poured out all her fear and all her anxiety, all her despair into this diary. She was a slaveholder. And you can just read in this diary just her power crumbling around her as the enslaved women, especially who tended to her house, start to resist, start to talk back, start to refuse to work, start to run away. And that's just a microcosm of a broader process that was going on in New Orleans even before the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's that context, that slow erosion of slavery you have to understand to grasp the confrontation between Rose Herrera and her owner, Mary DeHart, in that jail in January of 1863. James DeHart, the dentist, he fled to Havana in October of 1862. He had served briefly in a Confederate military unit in New Orleans. He was probably afraid of being persecuted by the Union government for his service, of having his property confiscated, generally being given a hard time. So he flees to Havana. This is a map from 1862, Colton's railroad map of the United States, and I love this little snippet from the map because it shows you the direct steamship connection between New Orleans and Havana, the steamship connection that would have taken James DeHart to Havana. So he flees, leaving his wife and her aunt and their son behind with Rose Herrera and her children. Why did the DeHarts go to Cuba? Why did they go to Havana? Well, first thing, it was pretty much the closest major city to New Orleans that was accessible to Confederate exiles. It was a 3-day voyage on a steamship, pretty easy to get to, and James DeHart would have been able to more or less recreate his life as a dentist in Havana, especially among the Confederate exile community that was coalescing there. But beyond that, Cuba was one of the places in the Americas where slavery continued to thrive. As it's crumbling in the southern United States, or the Confederacy, it continues to thrive in Cuba. And I think that's probably the reason why Mary DeHart was so eager, so insistent to take Rose and her children to Cuba, because she thought that would be a way to hang on to her property. Those slaves were the biggest asset that the DeHarts owned. and they wouldn't want to just give that up if they could hold on to it. They might have also anticipated that the Confederacy would somehow survive the war, would win the war, and slavery would endure. And when that happened, they could return to New Orleans with their slaves as their property, sustaining their wealth. It didn't turn out that way, but that was the idea. So that is why I think in January of 1863, Mary DeHart takes 3 of Rose's children and moves to Havana to be with her husband. Almost exactly 2 years later, Mary DeHart returned to New Orleans. This is January of 1865. The war was not yet over entirely, but slavery had been abolished in Louisiana by a new state constitution in 1864, which meant that Rose finally was a free woman. Somehow Rose learned that Mary DeHart had come back to town, so she sought her out and asked, requested, pled for her to return the children. But Mary DeHart said no. She wasn't going to bring them back, and she didn't have control over them anyway. Having received no for an answer, Rose did something quite remarkable. She had Mary DeHart thrown in jail for kidnapping. An unheard of, unprecedented kind of action. The first court to listen to this case is a civilian court in New Orleans, controlled largely by ex-Confederates. And the judge in that court threw out the case on the grounds that there was no law against what Mary DeHart had done. There was no law against a slave owner taking her own property with her to some other country. So what Mary DeHart did was not a crime at the moment she did it, according to this court. But Rose Herrera did not take that no for an answer either. She got Mary DeHart arrested by the military authorities in New Orleans, who ultimately tried Mary DeHart for kidnapping in a military court, a provost court that was run by the Union military authorities. Now, Rose did not do this by herself. One of the remarkable things about this case is she got a lawyer to help her navigate the intricacies of the legal system. And that lawyer was a man named Thomas Jefferson Durant. A remarkable name for the moment. This guy was a well-known lawyer in New Orleans. He had been a very prominent Democratic politician in the 1840s and 1850s. But once the Union Army came to town, DeHart sort of came out of the closet as an abolitionist, as somebody who actually detested slavery. He actually manumitted his own slaves during the Civil War and he became the leading white radical unionist politician in New Orleans, arguing for things like granting the right to vote to men of color. Really in the vanguard of unionist politics at this very moment. But he was also defending black women in the courts of New Orleans in custody cases. Rose's case was not the only child custody case that he litigated in court. So this is something he was doing in general. So the case is actually heard in a provost court in April of 1865. Really this exact same week that Lincoln was assassinated. It's not hard to see why a case like that might have been overshadowed by bigger events in the news. But think of this. Just think of the confrontation in the court between a former slave and her former mistress, staring each other down over who had the rightful custody of the children. Ultimately, the case was decided by the Union commanding general in New Orleans, a man named Nathaniel Banks, a Massachusetts politician. This is Banks' headquarters during the Civil War. Banks faced a problem. He really wanted to convict Mary DeHart of something. But it was hard to figure out exactly what, because the original judge, the judge in the civilian court, was basically right. What Mary DeHart did was really not a crime at the moment she did it. So, taking a cue from Thomas Jefferson Durant, Banks makes a quite remarkable ruling. He decides that Mary DeHart was not guilty of kidnapping, but she was guilty of violating, of all things, the Louisiana Slave Code, which prohibited children under the age of 10 from being sold apart from their mothers. This was a holdover from the Code Noir, the original French legal code governing slavery in places like Louisiana. It had never been enforced in the history, the more than 150-year history of slavery in French possessions. But at this moment, at the moment when slavery has already been abolished, the Union commander decides to enforce its provision. So it's a deeply ironic moment of the enforcement of the legal conscience of the slave system itself. But the ruling was strange because, in fact, it didn't quite fit the facts of the case. Mary DeHart had not sold the children apart from their mother. She had just taken them from their mother and taken them to Cuba. So it was a pretty tenuous ruling. But I think it illustrates the revolutionary quality of emancipation in a place like New Orleans, where the Union government is really making things up, making up a new law based on a new moral system, sort of making it up as they go along. That is sort of a quality characteristic of revolutionary forms of justice. But it was unstable. Banks leaves New Orleans a couple months later and is replaced by a new commander who accepts a petition from the Friends of Mary DeHart that the case was wrongly decided. And he concludes, yes, Banks was wrong, Mary DeHart was unjustly convicted, and so he actually releases her from the Julia Street female prison where she had been incarcerated. So he sets Mary DeHart free and instructs her to go back to Havana upon the promise, on the pledge, that she would send the children home to their mother in New Orleans. So this revolutionary justice was very unstable, and in August of 1865, Mary DeHart goes back to Havana. We fast forward a few months. By the end of 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States was ratified. Slavery throughout the country is ended. But January 1st, 1866, the Herrera children remain in bondage in Cuba. They're still slaves, despite the abolition of slavery in the United States. What to do? Well, at that moment, at the urging of Rose Herrera, Thomas Jefferson Durant writes to William Seward, the Secretary of State, imploring him to look into, to investigate this case and to recover the children. As Thomas Jefferson Durant writes to William Seward, a rumor spreads around the Gulf South that newly freed people are being kidnapped and sold into slavery in Cuba and Brazil. This rumor sort of percolates up to the highest levels of national power, and the United States Senate demands an investigation of the truthfulness of this rumor. They don't find a lot to it, although the rumor itself is fascinating, and I can talk more about that if you want. They don't find a lot of truth to this rumor, but they do find one significant case, and that is the case of Rose Herrera's children. So the report that the Senate ultimately publishes in March of 1866, most of it is dedicated to Rose Herrera's children. The report is titled, Upon the Supposed Kidnapping of Colored People for Sale in the United States and Cuba. That's the document I came across. That's the document where I discovered the case of Rose Herrera and her children. That's the document in which Rose Herrera's efforts to recover her children, this intimate family drama, rises to the level of a national and even international scandal. That is how Rose Herrera made history. Now, I'm not going to tell you if and how the children came home. I need to give you some reason to buy the book and read it. But I hope that just this sketch of the outlines of the case have given you some idea of its significance, of the way it humanizes and dramatizes the history of wartime emancipation. And I just want to conclude with this thought. It seems to me that there's a difference, an important difference, between abolition and emancipation. By abolition, I mean the legal overthrow of slavery. The Confiscation Acts, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment. The political process that ultimately abolishes slavery. That's one thing. But it's not the same thing as emancipation. Emancipation is the experience of freedom on the part of newly freed people. It's that moment when they tasted freedom, made it something real for themselves and their families and their kin and their communities. So there's always a gap between abolition and emancipation. And in that gap is the struggle of newly freed people for nothing less than justice. And I think when you look at the world around us, I think you can say with some confidence and sadness that we still have a ways to go before we move entirely from abolition to emancipation. So thank you for your time, and I would be delighted to hear questions and comments and thoughts about Rose Herrera and her world.
So now we move to our question-answer discussion period. The basic ground rules are if you would wait until the microphone reaches you before you start to speak, and when you do, please identify yourself before you ask your question or make your comment. Right back here.
James Sang.
Up the microphone.
James Sang, retired. You mentioned Nathaniel Banks, but his predecessor as junior commander in New Orleans was a notorious finagler who was famous for bending rules and bending laws. How did he enforce emancipation in New Orleans?
Yeah, great. Banks's predecessor was a very slippery and interesting character named Benjamin Butler, another Massachusetts politician. Butler's principal claim to fame, and it's a significant one during the Civil War, is he's the guy who coined the idea that Southern slaves could be considered contraband of war, and as contraband could be confiscated from their owners. He does this very early in the war as the commander at Fortress Monroe. So he's widely attributed to really starting the road to the unraveling of slavery in the Confederacy. But in May of 1862, Butler shifts down to New Orleans. And there he takes a very different approach. He's very explicit about it. His stated commitment as commander in New Orleans is to preserve the rights of loyal slaveholders and to do as little as possible to upset the slave system of Louisiana. He's extremely anxious that anything he does in Louisiana could potentially, first of all, alienate loyal white planters, and secondly, that anything he might do to take, poke at slavery could provoke a slave insurrection. So he's very cautious on slavery when he gets to New Orleans. But by the same token, he never really misses a chance to skewer a slave owner he believes is a rebel. So he takes the side on many occasions with enslaved people who ran away from people he considered to be enemies of the Union. So he's playing sort of both sides of the fence. I think enslaved people in Louisiana understand this and do their best to to appeal to him as friends of the Union against their masters, who they call enemies. So Butler's an interesting figure on the slavery question. He's known for doing a lot of very controversial things in New Orleans, including insulting the Confederate women of New Orleans. But I think not enough attention has been paid to his ambivalence about what to do about slavery there. It's pretty fascinating. Thanks for that question.
Yes, right there in the back.
Dave Rajewski of the Wilson Center. Could you talk a little bit about just how the numbers of how many slaves and slaveholders actually moved to Cuba?
Yeah.
And what was their story? Did they eventually move back? Did their status change? Did their legal status in Cuba change? Just what happened to that migration?
Yeah. The number of Confederate slaveholders who moved to Cuba is probably in the hundreds, possibly the low thousands, if you include people just who passed through Cuba on their way to other places, like on their way to Europe. So the number is not large, although by the end of the war there is a recognizable Confederate enclave in Havana. The actual number of slaves who end up or Confederate slaves of Confederate owners who end up in Cuba is really impossible to determine. It might be in the low hundreds. It's not very many at all. If you try to find hard evidence for it, Rose Herrera's case is one of the few cases where there's actually evidence for this. But people are talking about it as a genuine phenomenon. It's just hard to find out. It's hard to know how many there are. But I think it's useful to consider an even wider panorama, because just as some Confederates are fleeing to Cuba, others are going to Mexico. There's a fairly significant migration to Brazil at the end of the war. So the entire Confederate exodus is surely in the thousands. And they're really seeking a way to recreate their slaveholding way of life elsewhere in the Americas. Most of them end up disappointed. A lot of them end up coming back to the United States in the late 1860s. But even to this day, there are communities of the descendants of Confederate emigres in Brazil that retain a Confederate identity. They still fly Confederate flags, for instance, have cotillions and things, balls and things like that. It's very, very strange. But this international movement of Confederates, I think, is just sort of a slice of the broader effort of Confederates to find a way to hold on to slavery as long as possible. It's sort of the international outgrowth of the internal process known as refugeeing, of planters who tried to take their slaves deeper and deeper into Confederate lines to try to escape the clutches of the Union Army. There are thousands of slaves who were taken to Texas, for instance, during the Civil War. And as we know, among the last enslaved people to be formally emancipated within the United States are those in Texas, hence the holiday Juneteenth.
Don?
Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. I was wondering whether you could walk us through a little bit more of the legal aspect of emancipation. Lincoln issued it on grounds that it was a wartime measure, that the slaves were being used both to fight directly against the Union troops, but as well as supporting, obviously, the Confederate troops in different ways. Did the Lincoln administration consider it all conscription, both of slaveholders in New Orleans as well as the slaves, or is that not possible?
So what do you mean by conscription?
Drafting.
Drafting. Well, yeah, so the legal history of abolition in Louisiana is a little bit different than a lot of other places, because the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply. There you have a mixture of national policy, like the the confiscation acts that do play a major role in undermining slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the key corrosive elements to slavery is the enlistment of black troops. You actually have the enlistment of black troops in New Orleans before the Emancipation Proclamation. Famously, companies of free people of color offered their services to the Union. They'd actually offered their services to the Confederacy at the beginning of the war, but the Confederacy had rejected them. So when the Union government comes in, when the Union takes over New Orleans, they offer their services to the Union. At first, they're rejected, but ultimately, Butler, by the end of 1862, comes to see the wisdom of employing them. And that gets the ball rolling with the enlistment of black soldiers in Louisiana. In 1864 and 1865, especially as the Union Army extends its grasp over more and more of Confederate Louisiana, they do end up enlisting, and in some cases conscripting, black Louisiana men into the Union service. And thousands of black Louisianans do actually end up fighting in the Union Army. And once there are black men in Union blue, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain slavery in Louisiana. You see that happening in New Orleans even before the Emancipation Proclamation, with household slaves, men and women, running to the protection of black soldiers stationed in nearby garrisons. And once they have black soldiers with guns defending them, slaveholders' power just crumbles. So ultimately, in Louisiana, slavery is abolished through the ratification of a new state constitution in 1864. But by then, the abolition of slavery is sort of just ratifying facts on the ground in Louisiana. It's not, the legal abolition in that case is not insignificant, but just catching up with the reality.
I have any number of questions, but since you're not going to tell us how the book ends, I can't do the spoiler alert business, so
I will tell you if it's necessary to explain.
I'll try to avoid this. So my first question amongst many has to do with what occupation officials do when they occupy or they attempt to reconstruct a government. I would assume that Banks is an extremely busy guy. There's all sorts of things to do. There's a labor system to get up and running. He's not exactly friendly to the aspirations of freed people. There's contract labor that he's trying to enforce. So I assume that his daily plate is pretty full. And then there's Rose Herrera, who all has a petition, and he has to rule on this. I would think that this would be, the 200th priority, on a very long, detailed list, and yet he finds the time, and he invests the time, and he comes to her aid. He's clearly read, or his people have read, her attorney's descriptions of the legal issues involved, and he intercedes on her behalf when there's so much else going on. So how does this fit into his schedule? Is this is there a political point that he's trying to make that is larger than this individual case, and so the individual case is important? Or is he really simply devoting attention because he sees an injustice done in this one instance, and he will attempt to make it right?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's hard to know. I think that the most likely answer is that Banks was being pressured, or at least harassed, by Durant to resolve the case in Rose's favor. Durant is a very prominent unionist politician, not a somewhat unpopular one. He had made a lot of enemies. He and Banks were not always on the same page. But it's possible that that Banks's solicitude on this case is really a response to Durant. The other interesting figure here is the judge in the provost court is a guy named Norman Lieber, whose father is the famous Lieber who wrote the laws of war during the Civil War, which there's been some really great recent work. So the white Union politicians who are involved in Rose's case are not insignificant, and I think that has a pretty big reason why Banks is responsive. But he wasn't always that responsive, and I'll give you an example. In January of 1863, just on the eve of Mary DeHart's departure to Havana, George Herrera wrote a letter to Nathaniel Banks, imploring him to prevent the children from being taken to Cuba. This is the letter. My wife Rose it says, Major General Banks, sir, my wife Rose belonging to the widow Rowland of this city is now confined in prison by order of her mistress, who is on the eve of her departure for Havana. As she intends to take with her, without their mother, my 3 children, Ernest, 7 years old, Mary, 4 years, and Josephine, 2 years, I respectfully pray, General, that according to the laws of God and man, my dear children shall not be separated from their mother. I feel confident in your justice. I remain, General, your devoted and grateful servant, George Herrera. This is a really remarkable letter. It was not answered by Banks. I don't even know if Banks read it. It didn't appear in the evidence that was submitted at the trial in 1865. I actually found this in the archives of the Freedmen and Southern Society project at University of Maryland, an incredible project that has really transformed our whole understanding of the process of wartime emancipation. In the 80s, they went through the National Archives and photocopied just thousands and thousands of documents. And I was working with their archive and came across this letter. This letter was really the linchpin for the whole story for me, because until I found this letter, I didn't know what Rose's last name was. In the government document in the report that I was working with, her last name is spelled Elyra, E-L-Y-R-A. And I couldn't find anything about a family by the name of Elyra in the census or the city directories or anything like that. I came across this letter and realized that the name was Herrera. Once I realized that, all of a sudden they pop up in the city directories, in the census, in other kinds of sources. And that really sort of broke the case open for me. So it was dumb luck, basically, that I found this. A little bit of shoe leather archival research, but it really helped. But I think it was something of a dead letter, a letter that just got lost, never responded to. So that was Banks at the beginning of 1863. 2 years later, because of the different political circumstances, he, for whatever reason, is compelled to intervene in the case with a different outcome. And that is the revolution of emancipation, right there.
Right up here. Go back.
My question is back.
Your name?
Oh, I'm sorry. Patsy Fletcher, I'm with the DC Historic Preservation Office. You said that a few hundred slaveholders took their enslaved people to Havana. I'm curious about whether or not they stayed in Havana. Did they go to the interior of course, that very narrow island, and begin to replicate the whole planter culture? And then did they have any influence on the fact that slavery continued to last in Cuba for another 30 years?
Thank you for that question. I've been trying to figure out the answer to that question for some time now. I do think hundreds of Confederate slave owners did migrate to Cuba. Whether or not they took their slaves with them, I can't say for sure. I know that the DeHarts did, and there are a few other concrete examples where we have evidence that this is the case. And some of the evidence, for instance, comes from Cuban archives. I found correspondence in the National Archives in Havana among port authorities about whether or not they should allow the Herrera children and other so-called servants of Confederate emigres, whether they should actually allow them to enter Havana. Because technically that was in violation of Cuba's own laws prohibiting the importation of slaves and people of color that had been on the books for some time. But the Cuban authorities carved out an exception, sort of an informal exception for the servants of refugees from the Confederate states, sort of as really under the ethic of hospitality. There's not a tremendous amount of evidence that I found, but I wasn't there for that long in the Cuban archives, for North American slaves enslaved in Cuba in the 1870s and 1880s. But I did find one, which was really fascinating. In the late 1870s, this rumor that freed people are being kidnapped and sold into slavery in Cuba crops up again. It's what anthropologists call a diving rumor. It dives down and comes up. It dives down and comes back up. So it comes back up periodically. It comes back up again in the late 1870s. And the Hayes administration actually sends a Republican congressman from Louisiana to investigate the rumor. But he dies in Havana of yellow fever. So he doesn't investigate it. But the Cuban authorities do their own investigation. And I found the report. And they found one woman. This is the late 1870s. They found a woman on a plantation in Jinez, I guess that's about 30 miles outside of Havana. She was known as Juana la Americana, Juana the American. And her story was very similar to the story of Rose Herrera's children, that she had been taken by her owner from New Orleans to Havana during the Civil War. Then she had been sold in Havana and taken to an outlying plantation where she had lived for 15 years. She had, with no family, no friends, she had children, but they died. It was really a tragic story. So she's one. And I don't know how many others there were. We can only imagine.
Jim?
James Banner. Adam, no one in here would not welcome your effort to put a human face on these abstractions. I think you've done a terrific job. But could I take the liberty of moving you from being Columbo, Elliot Ness, and moving back towards the abstract? You make this very clarifying distinction between abolition and emancipation. I think there's no reason to challenge you on that. But what, if any, difference does that make to the existing historiography of slavery and freedom? Does it affect other works that we've gotten used to before your distinction? Does it change anything, any way in which we have previously understood slavery and emancipation, and if so, in what way?
I hope it does. At least I hope it makes us a little bit more precise about exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the transition from slavery to freedom. It seems to me that still and in general, we as historians use the words abolition and emancipation interchangeably as synonyms. And I think, in many cases that's perfectly fine. But I think making the distinction that I do between abolition as a legal process and a political one, and emancipation as a kind of social experience of freedom, is helpful in disentangling things that really are different. So there are histories of the abolition of slavery that are fantastic. I think of Jim Oakes's book Freedom National, which really traces the political process during the Civil War by which the Republican Party, especially the Republicans in Congress, moved towards a policy of abolition, ending with the 13th Amendment. That is a history of abolition. But Oakes's book is not a history of emancipation. It is not a history of how enslaved people themselves experienced the transition to freedom. And I think it is important to keep that distinction in mind. And I hope ultimately we will have histories that connect abolition and emancipation in a synthetic way. We probably do already. There are a lot of examples out there.
But then the history of emancipation.
Microphone. Wait for the mic.
But then the history of emancipation would also include the experiences of the slave owners, the former slave owners, and you move them into the picture too.
Yeah, that's true as well. Absolutely.
Arnita Jones, AHA, retired. First, I have a question that I'd like to disagree with the gentleman precedes down. Don't stop talking about how you did your research. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's really important for public audiences. We're a sort of semi-public audience here, but I think it's very important to hear that. But anyway, my question is, what was the demography of New Orleans and the metropolitan area around it? I mean, how many free blacks, how many enslaved blacks, how many white people? What was, where I'm going with that is, was there real danger of a big slave revolt or a big African revolt?
There had been one
Yeah.
in 1811. The biggest slave revolt in U.S. history took place just about 30 miles north of New Orleans, the so-called German coast insurrection. It was the biggest, but probably also the least well-known of all the slave revolts that took place in the United States. Whether Butler, for instance, knew of the 1811 revolt, I'm not sure. But the term or the phrase that kept coming up over and over in Butler's correspondence and just the public discourse in general about the danger of disrupting the slave system in Louisiana is the phrase "another Saint-Domingue." Another Saint-Domingue. There's a tremendous fear that the political and military turmoil around the war in a place like New Orleans is going to provoke another Saint-Domingue. Now, in terms of the demography, there's sort of like a donut. New Orleans itself, pretty substantial city in 1860, something like 160,000 people. About 13% of the population of New Orleans was enslaved in 1860. And that number, 13, and that number had been declining throughout the 19th century as slaves in New Orleans were largely drawn off into the plantation hinterland through the domestic and internal slave trade, while at the same time, New Orleans was a big magnet for immigrants. It was the second leading immigrant port to New York in the antebellum period. Now, a lot of those immigrants, go up to the Midwest, but enough of them stay in New Orleans so that 40% of the free population of New Orleans is actually foreign-born, like James DeHart, who was an immigrant from Amsterdam, who was actually Dutch. But although New Orleans itself did not have a very large slave population proportionately, it had a pretty substantial population of free people of color, probably another 15%, if I'm recollecting that correctly, of the population were free people of color. And there were lots of anxieties about their position, who they would side with, whether they would ally with the slaves or not. So that's quite one of the reasons why Butler ultimately accedes to the enlistment of free people of color is basically to keep them in check, to keep them on the side of the Union, keep tabs over them. But outside New Orleans, in the sugar plantation parishes, this is the Sugar Bowl of the United States. This is the one place where sugar plantation culture really thrives. Around New Orleans, there are black majorities. And that is, I think, the real reason why the authorities in New Orleans are so careful. Because there's constant movement and correspondence back between the city and the plantation districts around it. There's lots of examples of plantation slaves running to New Orleans. One of the Union officials in New Orleans, a Vermont abolitionist named Phelps, famously gathers runaways at Camp Parapet, just on the outskirts of New Orleans. And he and Butler clash over this, because Phelps says, free them, arm them, help them, whereas Butler says, you're out of line here, and you're really putting us all at risk. Anyway, I think it's the black majority outside New Orleans that Union authorities are most concerned about when they're concerned about insurrection.
I want to come back to the point about abolition versus emancipation. I think Jim Oakes would completely agree with your description of this, and he would probably, to put words in his mouth, would say these books are completely complementary. He's dealing with national policy, how the Republican Party maneuvered its agenda very carefully through Congress, and you're dealing with on-the-ground experiences that are shaped by, but are partly independent of those larger activities. So your book fits into, obviously, the emancipation side of the historiography, and it very much, from beginning to end, kind of reflects what I see as the sentiments, the sensibilities of the last generation or two of historians, building on the work that the folks at the University of Maryland have done. So I guess my question is this. Is there any way in which your work deviates or challenges that school? And in the second question related, in the course of doing this, what were the surprises that you encountered? Because so much of it seems to kind of resonate with the broader themes of the historiography. The specifics are really quite different, but I'm wondering if, as you did this project, what you came away kind of shaking your head going, I didn't know before, and this genuinely surprised me.
So first, the way this book deviates from the last generation of scholarship on emancipation is what I would call the micro-historical approach. The emphasis on a single life, the attempt to write a biography of an enslaved person that's more than just a snapshot. So in a way, it's a challenge to the mode of writing social history, which tends to deal in aggregates and generalities of experience. That work I am completely indebted to. This book would not have been possible without the generation of social historians of emancipation around the Freedmen and Southern Society project. It's also not possible to write this book without having Jim Oakes' book by your side to explain the ins and outs of the confiscation acts, which certainly turn up in the legal wrangling over who actually owned, whether or not Rose Herrera's children were actually slaves in January of 1863. There's a lot of technical legal arguments that work their way through the court case around Herrera's children that I certainly wouldn't have been able to understand without a book like Oakes to help guide me through the policy. So perhaps the deviation is one of emphasis or narrative or how you tell the story. And I really think it's important. I really believe that the next wave of scholarship on American slavery is going to be biographical, trying to get into the lived experience of particular people, particular communities, at particular moments of time, to see how they actually lived. that's what my book is trying to do, and I think there's other examples out there.
And the surprises?
And well, the biggest surprise is just the surprise that sort of launched the book at the beginning. I came across this document that said that freed people were being kidnapped and sold into slavery in Cuba and Brazil, or at least there was a rumor to that effect. That was a surprise to me. I had never heard that before, and I was trained as a historian of slavery and abolition. I read a lot about it. I had never come across this at all. So the biggest surprise was just that this was going on, that there was a rumor about it. And I'd never seen anybody write about it or explain it or work their way through it. So the book really starts with a surprise. And along the way, there were a lot of other surprises, like the marriage between Rose and George Herrera, between a slave and a free person of color. That doesn't really fit the mold of what we think we know about free people of color in general. So that was surprise. That's an example of sort of a little surprise that does reflect on the historiography of that particular issue.
On this side here in the back.
My name is Nan Lauer. I'm retired, and I'm also a senior auditor at Georgetown. My question deals with incarceration. If we could look at that, if you could make comments about how that fits within the context of a very fluid situation legally, what leads to Rose's incarceration? How did she get herself out of it? And what exposure did most either free or slaves, African Americans, have to that experience in New Orleans?
The prison and jail system in New Orleans was a real bulwark to slavery. That was true of many urban environments in the United States and elsewhere. Urban police systems in slave societies really did the bidding of owners. They captured runaway slaves and kept them in jail until their owners claimed them. Or if nobody claimed them, people suspected of being runaways would actually be sold out of jails. And in that way, I suspect a lot of free people of color were actually sold into slavery. Masters sent slaves to jails to be whipped, to be punished. Urban owners who for whatever reason couldn't really uphold their own authority in their households relied on the police and jail system to do it for them. So that's the case with Rose. Rose was accused of striking her owner's aunt, this woman, Madame Roland, who had also been involved in a sham purchase of her as well. That's a different story. Anyway, so the story was that she hit her mistress in the face and was sent to jail to be punished. But it was sort of an indefinite kind of incarceration. The way Rose told the story was that the mistress came at her with a coffee pot, and it just flew up in her face. So that's the way she described it. Rose said she was thrown in jail because she was saucy, just because she was insolent to her owners. So there's two different stories that were told about why Rose ended up in jail. And it seems pretty clear that Rose wasn't going to get out of jail until Mary DeHart told the jailer to let her out. And that was completely unaffected by the Emancipation Proclamation, or really the legal crumbling of slavery in New Orleans. And it should be noted that there's a big exception in the 13th Amendment, that slavery and involuntary servitude is still legal as punishment for crime. So that was an exception that you could drive a truck through. And in some ways, our current system of mass incarceration has its origins in the exception written into the 13th Amendment. One way of thinking about the 13th Amendment is not that it abolishes slavery, but it dramatically constricts the cases in which slavery is legally acceptable in the United States.
Amanda.
Could you talk
more about the legacy of Saint-Domingue. Were there ways that memories of Saint-Domingue shaped the exodus of Confederates, or their plans to flee, or shaped slaves' resistance to being taken out of the country with slaveholders?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Amanda Moniz from the
Thank
National
you.
History Center.
There had been a direct impact of Saint-Domingue on New Orleans in 1809, really from the beginning of the slave revolt in the early 1790s up through the first decade of the 19th century. Refugees from Saint-Domingue had made their way to a lot of different places in the Caribbean and the Americas, but one of the principal destinations was New Orleans. So there are a lot of people in New Orleans, black and white, who are descended, or either had escaped from Saint-Domingue themselves, or descendants, the children of people who had escaped from Saint-Domingue. So there's a direct connection of people with very visceral memories of the overthrow of slavery in Saint-Domingue. But even beyond that, there's just a much more diffuse kind of memory of Saint-Domingue, where Saint-Domingue is the nightmare of American slave. It's the nightmare vision of American slave owners. It's also the nightmare vision of people who are opposed to slavery, but can't really think their way to abolition. So I really would love, slavery is a terrible thing. We would be better off without slaves. But if we start going down the road to emancipation, we're going to end up with another Saint-Domingue. So it was, for, I think, policymakers in the United States, and certainly in the Confederacy, a warning against meddling with slavery. But the mirror image of that is many enslaved people, as well as free people of color, were inspired by Saint-Domingue. It was proof of the possibility of the overthrow of slavery, the possibility of black self-determination. So you do see the circulation of images and memories of Saint-Domingue in a more positive way among African American communities, including in New Orleans.
Well, on that note, let me say the book is available outside for purchase. We managed to get through without revealing the ending of the book. But I can say the ending of the book really is not its culmination. It's yet another window into the larger story that it's telling. And whatever direction it went, and I will not give it away, the rest of the book, I think, kind of beautifully uses the outlines of a life to kind of open up a window on an institution, on relations between masters and slaves, this lived process of emancipation that you were talking about. And so the power of the book comes not in its ending, but in the journey, the story that you tell along the way. So I would highly recommend it as a readable, powerful, and moving story for your consideration. Next week, we have Kathy Pice from the University of Pennsylvania joining us to talk about bookmen at war, librarians, intelligence, and culture in the Second World War. I want to thank our audience, and I want to thank Adam Rothman.